So whenever you're ready, Didier.
Okay, is everybody hearing me? Yeah, okay, excellent. Right, so thanks to the organizer for the opportunity to bounce ideas on the community. My purpose today is to try to go back to an old discussion about the order in which inferences are drawn, and to look at the notion of a mutual adjustment. And in order to do that, I would like to follow the following structure. I'll start off by sort of looking at where this notion of order between inferences comes from, then focus on mutual adjustment, and then get into the nitty-gritty details of the problem issues, which I will refer to as speaker knowledge. Then look at one solution that has been offered and try to understand what remaining issues there may be with this solution, as well as to offer a couple of solutions. So getting your inferences in order. If we go back to Grice, like one should, there is this idea that there is a sequence in the derivation of meaning from what is said to what is communicated, from what is decoded to what is inferred. That sequence is sort of relegating inferences to a second stage. But as has been shown, that sequence raises some issues. For instance, there is some material derived in the later stages that is often needed in the early stages. Levinson writes about what he calls Grice's circle. He says Grice's account makes implicature dependent on a prior determination of the said. The said in turn depends on disambiguation, lexical resolution, reference fixing, not to mention ellipsis unpacking and generality narrowing. But each of these processes, which are prerequisites to determining the proposition expressed, may themselves depend crucially on processes that look indistinguishable from implicatures. Thus, what is said seem both to determine and to be determined by implicatures. Let us call it Grice's circle. Right. If we try to illustrate this circle, we can look at an example like one here, where A says, where is the conference being held? And B answers, it's being held here, where the scenario has it that A is in Los Angeles, B is in New York City, and the conference that is being talked about is in Princeton, New Jersey. So what is of interest to us here is the disambiguation of the deictic term here, which requires access to a contextual assumption about the speaker's goal that will affect its disambiguation. In this example, an appropriate enrichment of the propositional meaning of B's utterance is achieved if a contextual assumption regarding A's motivation for asking her question clarifies that she is wondering if she can drive to the conference. So if the question is about driving to the conference, here gets to mean the East Coast. If we don't have access to that contextual assumption, the derivation of the explicature is much more difficult and problematic. So when relevance theory started looking into these questions, one of the moves was to actually show that inferences were needed very early on in the calculation of propositional meaning, in particular through explicatures. Then the family of inferences increased with various types of implicatures, higher order explicatures, etc. But at no point in these developments was there a sense of a sequence between these different kinds of inferential processes. Crucially for our example, explicatures don't come first. This is what is taking us to the notion of an ordering principle in relevance theory. The fact that no ordering principle is mentioned doesn't mean that there is none. If we look at the comprehension heuristic, we see that it states that Comprehension should follow a path of least effort in computing cognitive effects, and then crucially, that you should consider interpretations in their order of accessibility. This should ensure that inferences are processed in a sequence, so we still have an order, but that order is not fixed and is contextually determined. If we go back to our example 1, the contextual assumption regarding A's motivation for asking her question is going to be highly accessible, which will ensure that the contextual assumption is selected before the explicature on the deictic term here is derived. Now, the salient contextual assumption here creates an expectation of relevance that is guiding the next inferential processes, something that is described, for instance, by Unger. This type of process is what has been described as mutual adjustment. And to quote Wilson and Sperber, these inferential subtasks should not be thought of as sequentially ordered. The hearer does not first decode the sentence meaning, then construct an implicature and identify an appropriate context, and then derive a range of implicated conclusions. Comprehension is an online process, and hypotheses about explicatures, implicated premises, and implicated conclusions are developed in parallel against a background of expectations which may be revised or elaborated as the utterance unfolds. If we turn to another example, it can be seen that this type of mutual adjustment helps us understand how one type of inference can feed into another type. So this is, again, a well-known example. Alan says, "Do you want to join us for supper?" And Lisa's answer is, "No, thanks, I've eaten." In that example, a culturally salient assumption creates an expectation of relevance that steers the derivation of the explicature for the enrichment of the temporal deictic present in the verbal tense. Okay, so if we try to look at how this has been accounted for, this is, again, a table that you might be familiar with that shows how the unfolding of the inferences takes place, starting off with decoding, and then crucially at this stage, a contextual assumption is selected to the effect that the fact that one has already eaten supper on a given evening is a good reason for refusing an invitation to supper that evening. This will then be used to license another inference, one step down in the sequence, whereby the utterance is taken to mean Lisa has eaten supper this evening. So this is an enriched form of the utterance. And we can see with this example that we have an order in the sequence that seems to solve the riddle posed by Grice's circle. So quoting Carston here, "What seems to be a circle when considered purely analytically becomes in practice a matter of satisfying a set of simultaneous constraints with no requirement on the order in which elements of the solution are recovered." So in this case, the explicature can be derived after a contextual assumption has been accessed. So this lack of fixed order between inferences does create problems of its own at times. And for this, I would like to focus on another version of example 2, which is going to be our example 3, that goes like this. Alan says, "Do you want to join us for supper?" And Lisa answers, "I've eaten." In this case, we have an issue that I would like to refer to as a speaker knowledge issue. By speaker knowledge, I'm referring to speaker-related inferences, that is to say, inferences about the state of the speaker's cognitive environment. And in this example, we are going to envisage the presence of two contextual assumptions that are manifests to Alan at the time he has to process Lisa's answer. So the first contextual assumption is the one we already saw. The fact that one has already eaten supper on a given given evening is a good reason for refusing an invitation to supper that evening. I will refer to this as cultural knowledge. The contextual assumption number 2 states that Lisa has been suffering from a nasty bout of flu, which has made her sick to her stomach for days. And this will be an instance of speaker knowledge. It should be clear from these two options that the degree of accessibility of these two, the relative degree of accessibility of these two assumptions will determine both the explicature on the verbal tense and the contextual implication that one might derive after that. So specifically with contextual assumption number 1, the explicature will go like this: Lisa has eaten this evening. And the contextual implication will be she won't eat again. With contextual assumption number 2, the explicature is Lisa has eaten today, with the contextual implication that she can eat again. Right, so this becomes an issue because if the comprehension procedure were only guided by considerations of accessibility, there is a risk of generating an accidentally relevant interpretation, which would be considerable. In fact, we could even claim that the risk could be regarded as systemic. However, the second rule of that procedure, the comprehension procedure, relies crucially on the presumption of relevance being associated with an ostensive stimulus. So there is this notion of presumption of relevance, which is defined as an utterance is relevant enough to be worth processing, and it's the most relevant one compatible with the communicator's abilities and preferences. With this presumption of relevance, an ostensive stimulus creates an expectation of relevance which is acceptable for the state of the speaker's cognitive environment. Thereby, we find ourselves in a situation where speaker knowledge is required by the presumption of optimal relevance, which would ensure that the contextual assumption number 2 gets priority over the contextual assumption number 1 in example 3. Right, so that is one way to solve the problem. And if we think about an implementation for this, this approach, we can look at Mazzarella's proposal, which elegantly enforces this acceptability criterion by recycling epistemic vigilance for that purpose. Now, epistemic vigilance, according to Sperber et al., is a filtering mechanism or a set of filtering mechanisms between comprehension and acceptance, assessing the epistemic value of an interpretation, both in terms of the validity of its content and the reliability of its source. So Mazzarella's proposal is to extend the scope of epistemic vigilance so that EV, epistemic vigilance, could feed into the comprehension procedure information about the source, the speaker, and function as a checking mechanism which, I quote, interacts with the relevance-guided comprehension procedure and constrains the choice of its output. This would, as we were trying to achieve, guarantee that the more acceptable contextual assumption 2 gets selected over contextual assumption number 1 and preserve mutual adjustment. There are, I believe, a few remaining issues that need to be addressed with this proposal and with mutual adjustment in general. Okay, so starting off with this idea that epistemic vigilance with extended scope can do the job. Crucially, EV with extended scope relies on an existing module known to interact with the comprehension procedure to enforce acceptability. and this is a desirable property or desirable feature in the model, but it also implies that there must be some degree of similarity, and probably a very high degree of similarity, between the two types of EV processes. Now, if we focus on these processes, we could look at, for instance, the output of these two versions of epistemic vigilance. So original epistemic vigilance takes an interpretation, evaluates its source and content, adjusts its epistemic value. EV with extended scope, on the other hand, takes an interpretation, evaluates its source, cancels the interpretation, and resets the comprehension procedure. While it is clear that the evaluation of the source speaker is clearly part of both processes, there are important differences in the output of these two processes. Okay, if we now turn to another aspect of the two processes, namely the input, we can make the following comments. So both EV processes interact with the comprehension procedure, and that's a desirable feature. They both take an input from the comprehension procedure, and it would be interesting to find out to what extent these inputs are similar. So with the first option, we can assume that there is a high degree of similarity between EV and EV with extended scope, in that they both take an interpretation as input. So if they do, that would mean that the acceptability criterion, i.e. the inferences about speaker knowledge, will always be treated last in the inferential sequence, after interpretation has been arrived at. That is to say that in this first option, we are dealing with a post hoc process that generates a lot of inferential noise. So you generate a lot of inferences that are not necessarily going to be maintained. In the second option, the original epistemic vigilance takes an interpretation, whereas EV with extended scope takes various inferential elements before comprehension converges. In other words, we have two different types of input. And so that would mean that the same process could have or would have to handle two types of input. In both cases, these options come with some issues. With option one, we ask ourselves, why should the checking mechanism be postponed and happen post hoc? With option two, the question is, what kind of material is needed for the process, for the process to be able to converge? Okay, the last issue that I would like to deal with concerns mutual adjustment in general. And it is true that mutual adjustment offers great and desirable flexibility in the order in which inferences are drawn, but this comes at a cognitive cost, because suboptimal interpretations are generated, which means that there are additional cognitive costs that will ensue. More importantly, it seems that the theory itself predicts that the activation of an assumption in the cognitive environment leaves a trace. This would mean that activating contextual assumptions that will then be discarded will have an impact on their accessibility. And here's the relevant quote from Sperber and Wilson. Accessibility works as a result of some kind of habituation. The more a representation is processed, the more accessible it becomes. Hence, the greater the amount of processing involved in the formation of an assumption, the more often it is accessed thereafter, the greater its accessibility. The result of this system is that we would predict the system to try to limit inferential meandering, because it's one of its undesirable effects is to have an effect on the main comprehension procedure by affecting accessibility. effectively what it does is to make more accessible unwanted assumptions. Okay, so a couple of solutions that I'd love to discuss with you. The first one is to keep the insight into the insight used in epistemic vigilance with extended scope, and still harness the existing EV process to derive speaker knowledge inferences. But we would have to assume that some additional properties need to be added. First one has to do with the fact that there is pressure for that process, so EV with extended scope, for that process to kick in early. This in turn means that we would have to take partial bits of the derivational process as input. It also means that we would have to potentially generate two different types of outputs depending on whether we have standard EV or EV with extended scope processes. The alternative here might be that some intermediate module would have to intervene between the comprehension procedure and EV in order to solve the difference between the two outputs and inputs for that matter. Okay, there is, I believe, a second solution, and that's my concluding slide, which might constitute a more radical move that consists in reinstating some order in the derivation of inferences. Something along the line of saying speaker knowledge inferences come first. This may not be as iconoclastic as it sounds, and I would like to make a case for it within the theory as it is. So, summarizing what we've seen, the presumption of relevance places emphasis on speaker knowledge. There is a requirement for cost efficiency that puts pressure on cancellation and resetting. Unwanted derivations have undesirable effects on accessibility. So here's a proposal. We could assume that the presumption of relevance raises the manifestness and hence the accessibility of speaker knowledge assumptions, which ensures that they are processed first by the comprehension procedure. So this is solving the riddle by simply assuming that the presumption of relevance increases accessibility. The second way of putting it, but I'm not even sure that they are distinct options, is to simply say that the presumption of relevance creates an expectation of relevance that guides the search for relevance towards speaker knowledge. And that's a solution that is compatible with Unger's work on expectations of relevance. So that's my proposal for today, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Didier. We have 6 minutes left for questions if we're going to so let me see if I can see hands.
I'd like to stop sharing, but I don't know where to do that.
I think that's a clap, not a hand. Let's see. Okay. So
Diana, I believe.
Does Diana have a hand up? I don't. Sorry, I can't see. Okay. Yeah, Diana, do you have a question? If so.
Yes. Thanks. Thanks, Didier. It was really, really interesting. I just had a question concerning neutral parallel adjustment. I noticed that you talked about neutral adjustment and you left out the notion of parallel, which I thought it's actually quite indicative of an aspect that I thought could be worth thinking more about. So to which extent the fact that when we talk about mutual adjustment, the idea is that these different sub-processes are led in parallel, reduces the objection that you're raising against the fact that suboptimal interpretations would be generated.
Thanks. One point that I didn't insist upon is the fact that the model as it stands still very much relies on a sequence. So because the comprehension procedure uses accessibility as its sort of engine, I don't see how calling it parallel gets rid of the fact that you have to order these inferences. So some inferences will need to come before others. And that's the type of issue that I was looking into with the talk. Have I answered your question?
Okay, so yeah, I understand better your point now. So the idea is that you're excluding the possibility that there could be a real co-construction in parallel of hypotheses based on the assumption that the order of accessibility would fix the construction of these, would lead to necessarily a serial construction. So
I believe that in those cases that I looked at, there is a sequence. So I didn't say anything about the fact that other processes might be taking place at the same time. But at least when it comes to the derivation of those explicatures, or for instance, in the example that you use in your paper, the Neil example, the disambiguation of the referent of the name, in those cases, you need to have a sequence. So, and the sequence is built into the system.
Okay, thanks.
Deirdre, we have 2 minutes left for a question.
Okay. I was thinking of two ways that you could get speaker knowledge more salient than cultural knowledge, or more salient than other types of knowledge without imposing and ordering. One is your knowledge of the speaker is going to be highly primed by the fact that you're in contact with the speaker. And the other is your knowledge of the speaker is likely to be stronger than your cultural knowledge with respect to that particular speaker. So there are two reasons why a relevance-oriented system might bring up speaker knowledge, might use speaker knowledge before cultural knowledge. I've been trying to think of possible ways in which that could be reversed, and in which your cultural knowledge would somehow override your knowledge of the speaker, would be stronger than your knowledge of the speaker, and I can't think of it. So I was just thinking of ways to avoid, to get what you want without imposing a sort of artificial ordering on the thing, and which one should be able to manipulate that a bit more. I'm not quite sure how.
Thank you. There is perhaps a misunderstanding as to with respect to this idea of imposing an ordering here. What I tried to do in the last slide is to show that you can arrive at a situation where you will be processing speaker knowledge first, without actually having to stipulate that this is the case. So the fact that speaker knowledge receives very high salience is to some extent predicted by the model. One reason for that being the presumption of relevance. And going back to your question about finding cases where cultural knowledge overrides speaker knowledge, I'd love to find an example like that, but I don't think that finding one would necessarily be a problem with this.
Okay, yes. I don't see the presumption of relevance actually gives you automatically. Oh, maybe it does. Maybe it does. Fair enough.
It's the second rule in the presumption of relevance, which I think pushes you towards that.
I could recall the presumption of relevance. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, you may well be right. Thank you.
Well, as chair of this session, I think